we have an interesting panel, and I haven't warned them, so it'll be interesting to see what they say. The first question is, what responsibility does education have for the fragmentation we see in societies today?
Well, I think we need to first step up from the box that we're in our current education system that was largely created, I don't know, decades and decades ago when the world was different and our aspirations were different. And I think we need to bring our students and parents and educators and employers and policymakers together around the question of, first of all, what do we want for our communities and our countries and our global society? And therefore, what does that mean for what needs to be true for our young adults? And then we need to work backwards from that to say, so what are the implications of that for what we need to be working to accomplish in our schools? Right now, we have discussions about our aspirations for society over here, like at places like the Aurora Forum and the UN meetings and whatnot. And the educational discussions we have are almost fully divorced from those in many, many places around the world. And so we have a system that's focused very narrowly on a set of kind of academic outcomes, which are actually crucial, but not the whole picture of what we need to be oriented towards. So I really do think we need to step up and kind of reorient the whole system to be in line with our aspirations. And I think once we do that, we'll realize, and we could, I won't say too much more because there's so much to be said on this topic, but I will just say that one of the biggest challenges we will face is that every adult in the system is a product of the current system, and we will all have to unlearn so much that we learned in the system in order to teach in a different way, in order to foster the capabilities and the orientations and the mindsets and such in our kids. Like, we need to develop those ourselves. So we're gonna need to be understanding that, I mean, you know, per Kanya's point, like, we need to foster leadership among our students so that they can, you know, essentially create a better world for themselves and navigate a changing economy. That means we're gonna have to foster the leadership of the adults in the system and help them self-reflect on truly what their values are, et cetera. So I think we have a massive project ahead if we want to reach our societal aspirations, because you look in classrooms today and schools today and you do see what you will get. So this, to me, this is an urgent undertaking that we need to pursue.
Wendy, give me two things that you personally have to unlearn yourself.
Well, let me give one, just because. So, you know, I grew up in a school, in a system that taught me about my individual capabilities. And I learned if I work hard enough, I can, you know, I can succeed. But when you think about what kind of leadership we need to solve the very complex societal challenges we face, we need not individual leadership, but collective leadership, right? Like, we need individuals who can exert collective leadership, who can collaborate, who can work across cultural differences and, you know, languages and countries and such. And those skills, I did not learn those skills in my very homogenous school that valued individual leadership. So that's just one example. Like, and in fact, I mean, I'm on a long journey of unlearning, you know, my kind of individual frame and learning a new frame where I understand that I'm not the one who needs to solve all these problems, that it's going to take many different perspectives and people working together.
Well, I've partly already answered the question about what should change in education if you're trying to educate better for global citizenship. And just to repeat, I think it's more emphasis in our formal curricula on other countries, other cultures, the interconnectedness of the world and the necessity to sort of de-silo our thinking. Secondly, it is to maximise the sort of experience that the education in school and university provides of exposure to other countries, cultures, people. I mean, I just think in terms of so many of our own Australian universities, huge numbers of international students, Chinese students in particular, but they're very little integrated into the actual educational experience. It's a lot of ghettoisation still continues. So neither they nor our domestic students are getting the benefit of that international experience, which is so important to your life development. And the third thing is, somehow to try and inculcate a sense of, responsibility, that it's all our responsibility to work for a better world in whatever way we possibly can. How you do that in a formal curricular sense, I don't know, but it is an important part of the educational system just to expose kids to a whole variety of role models, I guess, during the course of their education through extracurricular programs, if not the formal ones, to give them a sense. Just on the subject of leadership, there's a spectacular shortage of political leadership, quality political leadership around at the world at the moment. I mean, it ranges from the underwhelming to the desolate to the appalling, and there is a question of what we can do about that. Can you educate people for leadership? I'm not entirely sure. It was famously said several decades ago that the real qualification for political leadership is not so much intellect or formal training, but temperament. And there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, you don't want anyone to be as dumb as Donald Trump is, but do you necessarily have to be as smart as Armen Sarkisian is in Armenia? I mean, what you really want in your political leaders is a whole variety of other qualities of empathy, qualities of capacity for strategic direction and other things of that kind, which I'm not sure. You certainly want honesty and incorruptibility. Can you teach those things in the education system, or are they inherently innate? And that's a question I think we have to ask ourselves if we're educating not only for good citizenship, but educating for leadership.
If I'm right, you're saying you want to maximise exposure. That's your big action. Is that it? That is the big one. We need people to move around, and when they do move around, not to move from ghetto to ghetto.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, the intellectual training I had as a lawyer and so on has obviously served me in good stead. Doing philosophy, politics, economics at Oxford broadened me out, and all of that was incredibly important in giving me a sort of a worldview which I was able to utilise in a variety of other roles. But the things that were really, really formed my experience and my sense of responsibility, that I had some larger obligation, were the travelling that I did, mainly in my young student days, and mainly 6 months of backpacking to and from across Asia and Africa and Middle East and Europe to England, and also a separate trip to Japan where I stood under the epicentre of that bomb at Hiroshima and just realised in the powerful way that a physical experience can make you realise just the quality of the inhumanity involved in that. I realised, visiting Saigon in the middle of the war, a crazy thing to do, just the squalor and the misery and the sheer horror, not of the battlefield, but of the major cities and just what goes on in that context. I realised eating and drinking with Cambodian kids in the early 70s, who I later realised had all been killed in the Khmer Rouge genocide. All of these things are incredibly personal ways of realising that there's a larger common world out there which we have some kind of responsibility to try to make better. So that's what I emphasise, experience. And it's a crucial part of the education to give kids as much of those sort of experiences as you possibly can.
All these policies and all these big discussions are necessary, but I think I would go on a more child level, where I think that if you invite those who are currently not getting a good education, as we qualify as good, which could both be curriculum and also that they feel part of a learning community, because there I see the biggest problem, that there are students who don't feel part of a learning community and therefore drop out. They cannot be successful because they're not invited to share their values, their culture, whatever their diversity is. They just feel that this is a white privileged, high education is a white privileged environment.
And is that because you're Swedish?
It could be. I'm born.
No, do you believe that because you have deep values Because the attitude to education in Sweden is very different, if I understand rightly.
Yeah, I would say that that's where my basic values come from, that education is a right, but at the time I lived in Sweden, it was very homogeneous. I'm sure they are facing some of the same issues that we have in the US today, where there are groups that just don't feel invited to the table. And I think we have to have an open conversation of what it is that divides us. Don't be shy don't be too politically correct. Talk about what the issues are. You're poor, you are rich. Let's talk about what we have in common and be aware of where the differences are and be respectful to each other.
And Anna, if I'm right, some of your work is to catch dropouts and bring them back into the system. So what have you learnt from all these grand policymakers? What have you learnt personally about how to bring somebody, how to stop somebody who's just as they're dropping out? What have you learnt?
Again, I think that the experience is, if you feel you belong, you can take a lot of adversity, a lot of things can happen to you that are not great, but if you feel part of a community, you are going to stay in school if you feel that you belong there. So I think that's where I'm coming from. There is, if you feel that you have support from people that are like you and not like you, you're more likely to stay in school.
So I've got 3 questions in here. One is about non-formal education. Another one is to what extent can education do values? And I've got another one, which is the role of the private sector in all of this, right? The people who are about to talk, are you going to pick up one of those issues?
The one Carol brought up about values. So let me build on that. The lens I'm taking is a very specific lens. That is to say that if we want education to be a force for good, we need to infuse in education what I would call the humanitarian spirit. And let me be precise, or at least try to be precise about what I mean when I say humanitarian. In my mind, there's actually 2 things that underlie this humanitarian lens into education. One is the notion of noble purpose, and that goes back to values, and I'll come back to that in a second. I'll give you an example. And the second one is a sense of preparing people for a particular role in society. And you need the 2. You need the values, and you need the ability to inspire people to become a particular role. So let me give you a very specific examples, because at that level of abstraction, it's actually hard to disagree with. But let me give you an example again from my higher education experience in Belgium at a university. We are faced with one challenge and opportunity, and that is that we have a rising demography. We have more and more students. The challenge is a lot of those students come from disadvantaged socio-economic background, and a lot of them come from a migration background, mostly from Muslim countries, Morocco and Turkey. The opportunity is, of course, that as an integration vector, the university has a splendid role to play. We've defined actually this humanitarian dimension in the following way. The role, we want the students that graduate from our university to become responsible citizens, okay? It's not necessarily being leaders, just being responsible citizens, but we have thousands of students graduating. How do you become responsible citizens? It is by injecting what I would call a toolkit, the enlightenment toolkit. Why am I using that? First, because in the name of our university, we are the free university. Free means that we are very much in the tradition of the 18th century Enlightenment. This means, very concretely, 3 types of attitudes. Attitude number 1, diversity is richness. Attitude number 2, outlook on the world, use rational, scientific, investigational mindset. That's a huge challenge. It's not by feeling, it's about rational inquiry. Third, and probably foremost, is how do you deal with each other? By deliberative dialogue. Deliberative dialogue is that when you speak with other people, you exchange points of views, you try to come up with a perspective that is underbuilt by rational thought, exchanged in respect with people that do not agree with you, and a ability to rationally come to an alignment for action. That is being responsible citizens. I can give you a second example, closer to here, UWC Dilijan. I'll just share my own perspective. This is not a strategy. Noble purpose, solving the world's most complex problems. Role, entrepreneurial leaders, societal leaders. How to do that? Very important. It's not only because through a curriculum, it's through a journey of personal psycho-development. In other words, to use a very simple phrase, if you want to change the world, you first have to change yourself. So the ability to help a school community to grow as human beings from child to adolescent to adult, that journey should become part of the curriculum. And I think this is a journey for students, and it's equally a journey for teachers. That's a second example, and I'll hold it to that at this moment.
We have to really understand in education and also get the freedom to do it, because I think that education needs to be considered as a stakeholder by itself, which has values that we can only deliver in society, like systems view, long-term thinking, transformation of thoughts, and so forth. And that is nothing that really, and also disruptive forces coming from any area, new area. I think these are things that other stakeholders in society cannot really provide. And if we are not considered as an equal stakeholder in the dialogue, I think it doesn't matter if education is private or public. It has no reason, because it has the same role in society. And the role is really to prepare the next generation to be able to do something that if we as humans believe that we are not part of nature, that means that we don't have to really be evolutionary. Then we can think about all the solutions, the next steps, and how to do what to do. Then we are going to die, because we need to set up the next generation so that they can really meet in intersections where there are going to be new, unforeseen solutions. And I think that education is the only ones that care about this, because who else would? I think this is very important part. I think we all actors in education, we need to get together and not work in our silos. And we have a really difficult situation internal, because we have created over the years silos. I alluded to it before. I think silos between different disciplines and schools, like people that are really contributing in social science. They will do it with their tool. They won't be open and really see what the solution needs. And I know also that engineers and on the technical side, that they have a hard time to really invite humanity and social science. So I think we need to really lift our eyes. We need to be also talk to all different levels of society, to be an equal partner on all levels in the dialogue.
As you say, bring diverse stakeholders together. Educators alone cannot do this, I don't think. But we need the educators, and we need lots of others to ask ourselves what we want to have be true, again, for our young adults, and therefore what we need to be working towards in schools. And of course we need to teach values in schools, but we need to start with like 3-year-olds, because neuroscience will tell us that values and mindsets are literally like fully formed by the time kids are 6. And so you think about, like, I think about this initiative called Think Equal that has a curriculum that teaches kids aged 3 to 6 values, like 18 values. You just think, now that's the solution to society. Like, you think if our world leaders had gone through that curriculum, would we be in a different place? I really think we might. But as you say, we need higher ed too. Like, we need all of us together thinking in systemic ways that we haven't always thought in, I think.
Thank you very, very much, Karin. Gabriel.
I've been thinking about my own education, so I'm going to make a public confession. There were 2 defining moments in my education. The first one is my brother and I were both taking Spanish guitar lessons, and my family could only buy one guitar. So the teacher gave the guitar to my brother, sample, gave it to me, gave it to my brother, gave it to me, gave it back to my brother, and gave me a triangle. That was the end of my music career. The second one was a math teacher that made me go from participating in math Olympiads to making the math classroom an experience similar to going to the dentist. That was the end of my science education. So by elimination, I ended up doing humanities. And because I spoke some English at the time, I ended up studying English literature. And that's completely wrong. It's a self-perpetuating model that gives you extra points for being good at what you're good and lets you drop everything else. So going back to Karin's point, we shouldn't have to drop one or the other. I was interested in astrophysics, but I couldn't do it because I failed math. And to me, there's something fundamentally wrong with that model. Kids want to discover, they want to learn. We need to maintain that passion for education as we grow. Any educational system that makes people hate a subject, hate an activity, have to choose, there's something fundamentally wrong. So I think that going back to your question of what do we need to change, we need to measure education not in a way that rewards you for being good at one thing. We need to reward people for trying different things, for showing values, not just knowledge content. Knowledge content is very different. I've got more computing power in my wrist now than my first 2 computers. So therefore, the deal has to be different. But if I go back to my school in Spain, the grades they give are still the same 30 years later. And there's something wrong. Because I think that we can all agree that the world has changed significantly in 30 years, but the classroom looks the same and the grades are the same. So I'm using value and assessment here, interchangeable. We keep valuing the same thing in education. And that to me tells us that that needs to change.
So what could education do to remedy this fragmentation in the world? What's your answer?
How many of you have had a real lesson outside the classroom? Something that you were not prepared for by your academic training. Life comes from the outside and beats you and prepares you for working with other people, for being open, for changing your views. In my education, we never did that. Many years in education, 4 different postgrads, not one of them prepared me for what I'm doing today. The fact that I had to learn those lessons outside tells me there's something wrong. I'm going back to your question about formal education. I think that formal and informal needs to be part of the same continuum. We need to integrate both.
I think what all of us are saying actually is that the way for education to take responsibility for solving these, massive problems in society starts with questioning the purpose of education in the first place. I think, for a long time, to Wendy's, like the first point you made, the system that we're in was created a really long time ago to produce young people who could thrive and function in a very different society than we have now. And so you have to start by questioning that. And in my view, and what I've seen in the US and what I'm hearing from all of you is, education needs to be about, starts with teaching the mindsets and values that give young people the confidence, the belief, the agency that they can make change in the world, that they can create the society, the life that they want to see. And then it also involves giving them practical experiences inside and outside the classroom that allow them to learn that they have what it takes to actually do the things that they see as needed in the world. And someone asked about the private sector. I think a lot of what has to happen for things to actually change in education, I think you were just saying this too, is we have to change the way that we measure success. Like, it all comes back at the end of the day to how we evaluate the success of a school, of a teacher, of a student. Like, if we're grading them the way that we're grading them now, there's no incentive for schools to actually focus on the things that I think everyone is saying matters most for young people. And that's difficult because it's hard to measure a lot of the things that we're saying matter, but if we can do that, and if we can bring together, the researchers and colleges and private sector, and I mean, in my view, obviously educators, but maybe most of all young people, and start to understand, start to come together around a new definition of success for schools and for young people, I think a lot can change as a result.
What would your definition of success be?
Well, I think the highest level, schools, education should prepare young people for the future, for their future, and for a future in which they in which they have the power and agency to make the change they want to see. And that, that will break down to all sorts of different things. It's, it's them having like values, mindsets, skills of all kinds. But I think it's all about them having the agency to create the future they want for themselves and the world.
People have been talking about purpose, silos, exposure, success, individual versus collective. Are these all things that ring a bell and say, yes, if you began to think about those things, we would have less dropouts? Or are you thinking they're in another planet from me?
A little bit of both. I think there might be, there is a need to revamp education to not only mean the curriculum we're used to. There are some real social issues and there are some real issues in society that prevent some of these students from succeeding. And I feel that the one really important part is going to be advocacy and to understand what individual students, what prevents individual students from being successful in the current schools. I think they need the base education, but I think that open conversation about what divides us, that can also, so we agree to live together, but to try to understand each other's diversity. And again, I just don't think you can be successful unless you feel you belong to this learning community. And I think UWC is an excellent example of how different cultures can live together, can learn from each other, accept each other's differences, but learn. But that is a pretty high-level education. The students that I have worked with really need to be able to understand their value and to express themselves within the schools they're at, and to understand that their opinion matters, so they can engage in the learning.
I'm interested that nobody on the panel has used the expression mental health. And I see it in schools as a pretty major issue, or am I wrong, Wendy?
Well, I think we could define it as an education. I mean, this is why I was like a little bit, because the health issues are so interconnected. And, you can look at the statistics of, people in prisons in the US and see the undiagnosed mental health issues are just an extreme factor. And I think about, how resources, like my kids, I don't know what they would do if I didn't have access to good mental health professionals. And I think about kids in low-income communities who never have that. I mean, that in and of itself will create completely different outcomes for kids, and it will lead those young kids to ultimately be very different adults. So absolutely, I think it's fundamental to the whole thing.
I was just going to relate to some experience I have seen also with, my husband works with these type of things in US, and really those kids usually have a quite strong ability to be part of society and learn. So it's not really a problem of that, but it's to engage people. So I have experience in Gothenburg to see how we could, from a university perspective, that we picked them from the areas, the suburbs of Gothenburg, where we had really problems. And when we did also the reality labs out in these areas to really solve these problems together with people that had dropped out or had different type of problems were outside of society. It was amazing how they got engaged, and I think that is a model that could work in many places. If we just make sure we take the complex questions from the realities we have here around us.
I have the privilege of working with 229 students from 80 different countries year on year, and you start seeing patterns. And one of the things that I think is happening is that there are less certainties, less grand narratives, less bigger systems of beliefs, so there's more question marks. And we are looking for reasons to believe. At the same time, the support systems are changing. We're more connected than ever, and we have more lonely people than ever before. And I think that therein lies some of the problem. That before you would be in a village, you would be in a strong family, you would be in community. Those are becoming diffuse and they're losing sense. And I think that part of the problem is that there's a huge search for identity at all levels. And part of the problem I see in the students we work with is trying to combine the idea that I'm an individual, I'm unique, with who I am. And the tension between the two creates a huge problem. Because you can be selected, you're very special, you've been selected to join UWC, you're a superstar, and then you realize that actually, where are my foundations? And I do think there's a problem with resilience. I think we are losing resilience somehow. There's lots of literature now on resilience and how to build up resilience. But I think there's something there. I cannot put my finger, but my intuition tells me there's something that we need to address there.
On the point of mental health, which I think is an absolutely key element, yes, it's a point of worry. I believe it's a point of tremendous opportunity. What I'm afraid of is that we, in education, look at mental health as a danger that we need to avoid or as an illness that we need to cure. And that we spend our attention on hopefully a small number of people who have real issues, and we neglect the opportunity to build on the energy of people who are waiting to be pulled upwards rather than being treated as patients.
Chair of the governing board of the Australian National University, and it really is extraordinary the amount of time we spend on health, welfare, safety issues, including mental health issues, which are raised constantly by the staff and student representatives. I think it would have been inconceivable that a governing body of my university, even 20, 30, 40 years ago, certainly when I was a student, would have thought these were issues at all. So partly it's a function of just a growing sensitivity, but there's also been a change. And I mean, one of the changes is, I'm talking about a university rather than a school environment now, but it is much more stressful, frankly, than it was in my day, when those of us who were privileged enough to be part of the university cohort were guaranteed future jobs without any question. We could loaf our way through university, not worrying much about the quality of our degrees and so on. Now there is really constant pressure. There's real uncertainty about the future of the economy, what the job market will be, whether people will have jobs. And they're being much less disposed as a result to do a lot of the extracurricular stuff that was absolutely routine in my university days, but now it's just something that sort of has to be squeezed in. So that's creating pressures. The other things that we're really hearing about all the time are the sort of sexuality issues, people wrestling with issues that weren't even acknowledged as issues 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but are very much part of the sort of growing up experience now. And people just in a social media environment and constantly exposed to, do people like me or not in this sort of context, when they're often still trying to work out what their own actual identity is. I mean, it's added a whole new layer of stress, and whether universities are very good at dealing with this is an issue that I think we have to constantly ask ourselves.
Wendy, is it possible to have a search for identity problem that doesn't result, in many cases, in fragmentation?
I think helping kids, putting that question far more centrally into what goes on in our classrooms and schools, I think is actually the key to one part of the key to overcoming fragmentation. Because I think our kids understanding and valuing their own identity and history and coming to understand the identities and histories of others from diverse backgrounds, and recognizing both what brings us together and what makes us different, and valuing both the similarities and the differences is some part of the solution.
Can anybody be helpful on the subject of the private sector one? Pierre.
Yeah. So obvious answer, yes, there's a role for the private sector. Let us try to be more precise again about that. That is that, in general, I think the public sector is in need of reform, and reforming a system is just intrinsically complicated. So the time horizons, the trade-offs, the stakeholders that are involved, that is a skill that requires a lot of time, a lot of energy, and through policy making can actually develop across long time horizons. The private sector brings an ability to define clear goals, the ability to mobilize resources, and to define clear impact KPIs that then can be delivered. The trick is to combine these two. I'm struck by one thing, to give you an example of how these things work together. And that is, it comes from a dialogue that we've been having over the last couple of years here between private sector initiatives in education and large multinational organizations like the European Union, World Bank, etc. And there's a great complementarity between the two angles, and I speak under the control of distinguished representatives. There is a need for legitimacy that can only come from the public sector. There's a need for policy making that can only be crafted, it can only be made concrete through public sector initiatives. The private sector cannot define policies and not edict policies, okay? That still remains public sector. Implementing ambitious initiatives in short periods of time, mobilizing hundreds of people, deploying resources, program management is something that the private sector can do. The challenge and the opportunity is bring these two mindsets together. When it is done well, it can work tremendously. So I'm not pleading for just private sector, and I recognize that the public sector is in need for complementary role from the private sector. That's where that sweet spot is the one that we should be looking for.
In addition to that, I fully agree with this public sector, private sector, but educational sector is also important here to really get connected to this, because we have in a private sector we have very good teachers, we have very good environments, and we have very good research on the same level, of course, as we have in the educational sector. No doubt, it's there. But what the private sector don't have is to really get a grasp on what kind of disruptive forces are going to come in the future. And there it is essential that we build up a relation between the educational sector and the private sector on a strategic level. And I have many examples of how beneficial that can be if a private sector wants to survive.
Global competencies in a fragmented world. And what about Minerva's new model, which is using technology in a much more interesting way?
I think they're doing something really incredible. I don't know, I mean, of course, technology is an enabler, but I think what makes it incredible is more that they did step back and ask themselves everything from what do we want to accomplish for kids, and then they just essentially have rethought every single thing about how to be a higher ed institution, from what they're looking for in the kids they're selecting, to how they select them, to the culture they build, to how they're building the competencies in kids. And I think their early results show that kids are learning much more than they do in many higher ed institutions using the same kind of measurements. So I think it's worth diving into and really looking at. And they're doing it all at a much lower cost, et cetera. So I think that's really encouraging. And I think the case for building global competence is what we've been talking about. Like, we need a different world. We need so many of the problems we face, from environmental degradation to public health crises to conflict issues, require global collective solutions. And if our leaders have not gained the skills to work across lines of difference, to collaborate, to take a systemic view, there's no hope. And that really means that our teachers need to develop those competencies, and our educators do, and in turn, they need to foster them in our kids, who will hopefully change the world for the better.
If something breaks at home, what do we do now? The blinds break, the washing machine doesn't operate, there's an automatic reaction. We Google it, we YouTube it. You can now repair the blinds at home. You find the right YouTube video, you follow the steps, and you do it. So on that level, there's a huge power for technology, because you can have access to information directly. And that's why I like the idea of flip learning, where you can do that kind of learning on your own. But then when you're working with others, you can work on collaboration, you can work on communication, on those very important things that don't have a place elsewhere in the curriculum. And I think we need to combine the two. A totalitarian view of education in just technology focus is going to miss completely the humanitarian angle that we were talking about. But only collaboration with no content, no access will also fail. So I think we need to combine the two.
I just have one comment. I'm back again. Look at all of us. We come from different places in the world. I think we can turn around and talk to each other and make change. It's a little idealistic, but this gathering in Yerevan is quite remarkable. And I don't think we can just trust our leaders to make change. I think we have the power to make change ourselves by connecting here and now.
I also think that we have to think about the sustainable goals universality, which is very well described but not practiced. And it really goes in, we have to have an outside-in view, and when we are working together, we work for the cause and not for our own brand.
Whether you're a young person in school or you're one of us, to remember that we can make change now. And that, you're right, I think that there's a revolution needed, not just evolution, and that only happens if people come together and, and say, we have the power right now to change the things that aren't working.
I must say that revolution is something we feel that we can do and accomplish something, but I think we really need to to realize that we are part of nature, and we have to put the unforeseen in play. And have an evolutionary meeting where new ideas come up. Also, we cannot figure it out ourselves. All the steps going forward. I think it's super important.
Can I just say finally that theme that's emerged in the last couple of minutes about the critical importance of a collaborative, cooperative mindset in approaching problems and approaching your role in society, both domestically and internationally, is absolutely critical. It wasn't on my list of critical issues when I started out, but the more I think about it, that's one of the things that is absolutely critical for our schools and universities to instill. Of all the many, many stupid things that the US president has said in recent times, I think probably the stupidest of the lot was his assault on multilateralism and his insistence on the sovereign, independent quality of individual countries. The world is full these days of what Kofi Annan used to call problems without passports, problems that are not confined to particular countries, not capable of solution by individual countries or even pairs of countries, however big and strong they are. Whether you're talking about climate change or whether you're talking about unregulated population movements or people or human trafficking or any one of an innumerable arms control, any one of an innumerable number of other subjects, you can only get there by cooperative mindset, cooperative solutions, cooperative institutions. So inculcating that spirit, that sense of the absolute necessity of working with others is probably one of the best responsibility lessons universities can teach and schools can teach their kids. So I think that's an important theme to finish up with.
So I want to have my last word be to quote, "To have a better society, we should pay attention to the education of today's students." Now, let me just say, of course, this seems like the most trite thing to say, right? But we don't act on this. I mean, it's so obvious. If we want to have a better world, we need to pay attention to the education of today's students. We're not acting on that. If we want to live into the aspirations that Aurora has, like a better world for all, we need to be having a very different conversation in education than we're having.
Thank you very much for coming today. Bye-bye.